book of Psalms tonight. We're going to be looking at Psalm 14. And though the classifications that people give to Psalms can be helpful, people really struggle with this Psalm. You know, what do you classify it as? And tonight I would just say this. For us, it's a teaching Psalm. That's the way I would say for us to think about it. In your own reading of Psalm 14, in our study tonight, just view it as a teaching Psalm. God is teaching us tonight. And He's teaching us a lot of things, but if you want to think of maybe just one thing right now, He's teaching us about a fool. That's what He's teaching us about. You may say, as you notice in the superscription for the choir director, your Bible may say, why would we sing about the fool? And I think one reason is to show us what not to be like. It's teaching us. Don't be like this man. It's very much like a proverb, I think. Don't be like this guy. Don't act like him. And we're going to see more tonight, I trust, as well. Let's read this psalm together. And may the Lord add His blessing to the reading. The fool has said in his heart, there is no God. They are corrupt. They have committed abominable deeds. There is no one who does good. The Lord has looked down from heaven upon the sons of men to see if there are any who understand, who seek after God. They have all turned aside. Verse 2, the Lord has looked down from heaven upon the sons of men to see if there are any who understand, who seek after God. They have all turned aside. Together they have become corrupt. There is no one who does good, not even one. Do all the workers of wickedness not know, who eat up my people as they eat bread, and do not call upon the Lord? There they are in great dread, for God is with the righteous generation. You would put to shame the counsel of the afflicted, but the Lord is his refuge. Oh, that the salvation of Israel would come out of Zion, when the Lord restores His captive people. Jacob will rejoice, Israel will be glad. So let's look at this tonight in three parts. First, I want you to see is the fool's character. What is this fool like? And I think the first thing we have to do in looking at verse 1 is try to identify who this fool is. The word here for fool carries with it an idea not simply of being naive, not simply of being silly. It has some of that, I'm sure. But it carries the idea of being a sinful fool, a wicked fool. The Legacy Standard Bible, a new translation that's built upon, in some sense, the New American Standard Bible, actually translates this, I think, wicked fool here. So this is not just somebody he just didn't know any better. You know, he's out there kind of chewing bubble gum, looking at the sky, and he falls down. And, well, no, this is a wicked, sinful fool. And his character, what kind of character does this man have? Well, look what he says in his heart. The fool has said in his heart, there is no God. Of course, this speaks to the atheist who says not only with his heart but with his mouth there's no God. But even with that, and maybe primarily, this is, I believe, not speaking primarily at an atheist, though he is included in this. This is speaking of the practical atheist. Any of you ever heard that term, practical atheism? It's a term that some of the old preachers used years ago. And the idea is this. This man, this fool here, is living his life. He may very well believe in God. He may very well be part of Israel. He's living his life as if there is no God. He's a practical atheist. And when you think about it like that, we've got a lot of fools. And I don't mean this in a name-calling way. We've got a lot of fools around us, don't we? They live their life, churches all around, and they go about their life. They may even have a Bible at home. Maybe they read it. Maybe they even go to church sometimes. And yet their life, if you looked at their life would look no different than an atheist. They may believe in a God. They may believe in gods. They may believe in the supernatural even. They could be atheists. But the big point here is they live as if there's no God. They don't pray when they get up in the mornings. They just start their day like God doesn't really care about them. It doesn't matter. The Lord's Day comes. They don't gather to worship. They just act as if God really isn't there. They have a big decision to make in life, and they never pray about these decisions. They just kind of make their own decision. They live just like God's not there. Well, that's the outlook of the foolish man that David is writing about. His outlook is, there's no God. That's just the way he sees life. And so many people are like that, and honestly, we, including myself, sometimes have that characteristic, don't we? We got a big decision to make. Now, our brother asked for prayer, didn't he? That's good on this big decision, this big job coming up. But sometimes a big decision is made and we just know the way and we just jump into it, and sometimes we make a mess of things, don't we? Because we're living like the fool. We're living like a practical atheist. So the very first thing about this foolish man is he acts as if there's no God. He's just going about life. He's licking his finger. He's sticking it up. He's the captain of his life. Where does the wind blow? I think I'll go this way today. And that's what he does. He's a practical atheist. But then look how he's described. It says, they are corrupt. Now again, this is not just speaking of atheists here. This is speaking of anyone who fits the pattern of a fool. Not just atheists, but anyone with this outlook. They are corrupt. Not only do they think in their heart, and no doubt, as others have pointed out, the way that he thinks in his heart, the way his mind is, the way he lives, well, obviously it's going to produce corruption. This man's character is one of corruption. And look what corruption leads to. They have committed abominable deeds, vileness, things that God abhors they do. God hates what they do. Now just hold your place there. This word corrupt, I want to turn to Genesis 6. And I want to go ahead, and while you're turning there, I'll kind of spill the beans. Is that this passage we're looking at is the passage, or a very similar passage. Psalm 53 is almost identical. This is the passage that Paul uses in Romans 3 to describe all of us. And part of the point is, all of us at one time in our life was like this fool. All of us at one point in our life, like Psalm 14 says, lived our life as if there was no God. All of us were corrupt. So when we hear Psalm 14, I should not be tempted to stick my nose up and say, I'm glad I'm not like the fool. Because I once was the fool. Paul says that in Romans 3. All of us were like this. Jew and Gentile, we all were sinful before God. Well, I'll turn to Genesis 6. It's so interesting. That word corrupt is used here. And one of the wonderful things about the Bible, there's so many different authors. It was written over so many different years. And yet, there's just one message. It all goes together like a beautiful tapestry. This goes back to the fall. This goes back to the flood. And look what Moses says. Genesis 6:11. Now the earth was corrupt. Same word used as the fool there. In the sight of God, and the earth was filled with violence. Verse 12. God looked on the earth, and behold, it was corrupt. Same word. For all flesh, all people, had corrupted, same word, corrupted their way upon the earth. That's the lot that we have in life. All men had corrupted themselves. Look back in verse 5 while we're in Genesis 6. Look in verse 5. Then the Lord saw that the wickedness of man was great on the earth, and that every intent of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. That's the full. That's also our lot before we're saved. We were sinful. We were wicked. Psalm 14, what's this man's character like? What's the fool's character? Look what it says in verse 1. After it says he's corrupt, after it says he does abominable deeds, it says, there is no one who does good. Do you remember Paul saying that in Romans 3 about all mankind? I'm going to pause here. When you see this first verse about the fool, what he's saying in his heart, you see he's corrupt, and you see he does these vile, evil, wicked things. And then the Bible, God says, there is no one who does good. And here in the context, he's not speaking of Christians. He's speaking of those who are not Christians. He's speaking of unbelievers. He's speaking of fools. What is some of the things that come to our mind when you see there is no one who does good? What comes to your mind? Yeah, that's very good. I think overall that has to be what it's doing. It's going back to the fall of man. Romans chapter 5 says, because of Adam, we've all sinned. Sin entered into the human race. This is going back to creation. I went back to the flood. You've gone back to creation, to the fall. Yes, I do think that's part of it. That's very good. What else comes to our minds here? Do any objections come to your mind? Now, with the crowd like we have tonight, we may have some questions. None of us probably have objections, but a lot of people, if they heard this from you, would have big objections. What do you mean nobody's good? What do you mean nobody does good? Are you kidding? I'm not a believer, but I'm just as good as anybody else. Well, look what comes next. David's anticipating an objection, I think. Because look what he says. Look what the Lord does. Right after he says, no one is good, verse 2, the Lord has looked down from heaven upon the sons of men. Notice he doesn't say fools there. He says the sons of men, everyone. Not talking about his people, but everyone who's not his people. David makes this big statement. There is no one who does good. And then he says, okay, the Lord has looked down from heaven to see if there are any who understand. Is there anybody on their own who understands the things of God? Does anybody understand their need to pray? Does anybody understand how to live life right? Does anybody in all the earth? It's not David looking, it's God looking down. God looks at man. Is anybody here, anyone, God says, able to understand? And then he says this, who seek after God. Is there anybody on earth who's seeking after God? The answer is no. Now, you sought God when you became a Christian. And that's glorious. And the reason you sought God and came to Him and repented and you gave your heart is because God came to you first. That's the wonderful news. If it was just left to us, you know where we would be? We would be behind a tree somewhere in the garden, hiding from God. I mean, I was just fine. Besides when the conviction came, besides when my conscience condemned me, besides when I thought about death and dying and going to hell, I was just fine in my sin before I became a Christian. It was God that came to me. And He's so good to do that. David makes this statement, there's nobody good, and then he says, and God looked down on earth, and God has searched everyone's heart. God says there's nobody. Nobody's seeking after me. You hear about the righteous pagan somewhere out in the jungle somewhere. Well, he really loves God. It's not true. Nobody seeks for God. Now, God gives His grace, and God can stir someone's heart, and a missionary, God can do a lot of things. But on their own, nobody seeks for God. And then look what is said in verse 3. This is like the kill shot. I mean, verse 1 at the end was someone may say, that was bad enough. Then verse 3 comes, and it's over. It's a knockout punch. They have all turned aside. Together they have become corrupt. There is no one who does good, not even one. No one of the sons of men outside of the people of God are doing good, have good hearts, love them. God says there's nobody like that. That's the character of the fool here. And let me look at one other place. Mark chapter 10. And listen to what Jesus says. And this would probably be helpful to see as we see the character of the fool here. The character that none of us want to be. We don't want our kids to be like this. We don't want our grandkids to be like this. No. Though all of us at one time in our life, we had this character because we had sinned against God. Mark 10, verse 18. This rich young man has come up to Jesus. He's a ruler. He has said, "Good teacher." And here's how Jesus replies to him. And Jesus said to him, "Why do you call me good? No one is good except God alone." And that is the Bible's message throughout the entire Scripture. We are not good people apart from Jesus Christ. We can do no good. Even when we do good, maybe you can think back in your past as an unbeliever. Maybe you did some things that were good, but you can also remember the reason you did them. Maybe you did them because you wanted to impress somebody. That's bad motive, isn't it? Maybe you did some heroic thing so you could be praised. That's bad motive, isn't it? So this fool's character, we see it here, it's corrupt, it's evil. But I want you to look down in verse 4, 5, and 6. And just look at the foolishness of what's going to happen to this man. The fool is going about life. The fool is going about life. And he thinks he's something. The fool is wiser than 7 men, the proverb says, or something like that. Than 7 men who can give a discreet answer. He's just going through life. He thinks he's the man. She thinks she's the woman. Everything is great. God says you're corrupt, and look at the folly, the end of his life. Verse 4, do all the workers of wickedness not know? David says, don't you know? Don't you know what's going to happen to you? Don't you know your end? A lot of people want to start something in life, but they don't think about the end of it, do they? They don't think about where it's going to take them. Well, here David says, do all the workers of wickedness not know, who eat up my people as they eat bread? They go about life. We eat a piece of bread. I don't because I can't have gluten, but you all know what that's like. And, it's a loaf bread. It's nothing. If you're halfway done with it, you just throw it outside and forget about it maybe. Let the animals, it's just not, you just eat it. It's so simple. You just eat the bread. And David says these wicked people are eating God's people like that. They're destroying God's people. They don't think anything of it. And do not call upon the Lord. These people, they do not know what they're doing. They do not know the end. And then look in verse 5, what's going to happen. There, they are in great dread. And I think the picture is, perhaps, there, when judgment happens, when God comes, there the wicked's going to be in great dread. They don't think of the end. They don't think of what's going to happen to them living this way. They think that they can just be fools and live wickedly, but somehow at the end of their life, everything's going to be okay. David says, no, it's not going to be like that. Something has to change. Something has to happen. And that's what's happened in our hearts, isn't it? You remember the life you lived? You remember the way you used to think? God saved you and He forgave you and He changed you. Well, that's yet to happen to the fool. His character is corrupt, and you just see the foolishness, the end. Verse 5, for they are in great dread, for God is with, now listen to this, for God is with the righteous generation. Now, where did that come from? David spent the first 3 verses saying that nobody's good. Where did this righteous generation come from? And the answer is it came from the grace of God. It came, Romans chapter 3, as we humble ourselves before God, we repent, we believe the gospel, and God gives us the gift of righteousness in His Son. It's by faith. If you're a Christian tonight, now this can be abused, but we're not abusing it tonight. And I say this reverently. In one sense, tonight, if you're a Christian, before God, you're just as righteous before God as Jesus is. And here's the reason why. Because it's His righteousness you stand in. It's not anything in you. He's given you the righteousness. That's the only reason we can go to heaven, is because God's forgiven us. He's clothed us. He's taken the righteousness of Jesus and He's clothed us with it. And now we stand, we're not standing on our own good works, but we are standing now in what Jesus has done for us. And we're a righteous generation. Yes, of course, we want to live holy. We want to do practically what's right. All that is true. But we stand in this righteous gift that Jesus Christ won for us on the cross. That's why we're going to heaven. We're not going to heaven because we tried harder. We're not going to heaven because we're smarter. We're going to heaven because by God's grace we humbled ourselves. And God gave us the gift of righteousness. That's why we're going to heaven. And then look in verse 6. You would put to shame the counsel of the afflicted. That's what our enemies want to do. Our enemies hate any good thing that we're doing as Christians. They want to destroy our church. They want to make a mockery of it. They want to make a mockery of you. They want to do away with any good thing you're doing. Maybe you've had some bad times and you're down. Well, the enemy wants to kick you while you're down and mock the counsel of those who are cast down. But here's the good news. But the Lord is his refuge. The Lord won't allow that to happen. Then finally, what I want you to see in verse 7, you see the fool's character, you see the fool's foolishness, his end, what it's going to be like. He's going to fail. He's going to die lost, unfortunately. But you see deliverance from the fool in verse 7. That's what we hope for. That's what we long for. We don't want the fool to be lost, do we? We want the fool to be saved. But we also want deliverance, don't we? That's what verse 7 is about. Oh, that the salvation of Israel would come out of Zion. When, not if, but when the Lord restores His captive people. Jacob will rejoice. Israel will be glad. One day God is going to restore us. Jesus is going to come, set His kingdom up. All things are going to be made right when the Lord comes. And that's what we long for. That's what we need. Let me give you 2 applications from what we saw tonight, especially the first 3 verses. So you got the fool. Again, all of us have been in this category at one time in our life. The fool does not do good. The fool does not seek after God. The fool has turned aside. There is not anyone, no, not one, no one is good before God. We really need to pray for people, don't we? To be saved. We need to pray for God to convict men of their sins. Because men aren't, we don't have a police officer or anyone here tonight. How many criminals turn themselves in? Not very many. How many sinners turn themselves in? No sinner has ever turned himself in. So we really need to pray for our loved ones, for our people in the community, that God would convict their heart and that God would take our little witness, our little words, and take it at His good pleasure and convict someone's heart to bring them to salvation. And secondly, we need to evangelize. They're not seeking for God. And that, I was thinking about this afternoon. And of course, we've talked about evangelism. We got these gospel tracts, other things. That's good. That's good. But you know what? If people aren't going to visit the church, we're going to have to go visit them, aren't we? We're going to have to go bring the gospel to them. And I've invited some people to church very recently, and given them tracts and things like that. And that's fine. That's good. The setting I was in really didn't lend itself to witnessing at that particular point, really. But we're going to have to witness to people and trust that God will convict them. I did a very strange thing. I was about 19 years old. I didn't like going to church. I showed up at a non-Sunday morning service once by myself. Why did I do that? It was because God was convicting me. I had to get help. And we're going to have to see the Lord, by His grace, convict people. I really do think that is the missing key, is this conviction in people's heart, because if someone's convicted, they can't sleep, they can't stay away, they got to do something. We need to pray. I need to pray for God's conviction to come upon people, just like the people we've read about in Psalm 14. Don't be the fool. Rejoice that you will be delivered one day.